Jonah lived on the 37th floor of a steel and glass skyscraper that overlooked miles of architectural sprawl. The constant rumble of traffic below was muffled by the building's thick windows, leaving him in a hush of isolation. He rarely went outside. Whenever he felt compelled to step into the streets, he was overwhelmed by rushing crowds and the cacophony of horns, sirens, and urgent footsteps. Instead of braving that discord each day, he spent most of his life in front of a blinking cursor on his laptop, typing away at stories that no one else ever read. He was, in his own words, a shadow in a city of lights. Every morning, Jonah checked his mailbox, which was invariably empty. Fan mail or publishing contracts had never crossed his threshold, and he had grown used to the dream of being a famed novelist slipping further out of reach. That dream was replaced by something quieter, simpler, to write for the sake of writing, to conjure new worlds on the page. It was this devotion, obsession, some might say, that led him to notice, one evening, an odd shimmer in the words he typed. The lines on the screen momentarily glowed, pulsing with a soft luminescence. It lasted only a flicker, so brief that Jonah wondered if it was simply his tired eyes playing tricks. But strange incidents started occurring around his apartment. Fresh groceries appeared in his fridge, even though he couldn't remember shopping for them. The patch of ivy that clung to a ledge outside his window suddenly erupted in pink blossoms overnight. His old typewriter, long abandoned in a corner, inexplicably spun its keys each time he finished writing a paragraph on his laptop. The keys moved silently, as if typed by invisible fingers, but printed nothing. Jonah grew uneasy with each of these signs. He was a recluse, but not superstitious. He had no explanation for any of it. As a test, Jonah tried something small. While drafting a short story that featured a scraggly stray cat with mismatched eyes, he meowed, perched on the railing of the tall apartment building. He glanced over at his own balcony to confirm there was nothing unusual. At first there was, yet minutes later he heard a soft mew. Peeking through the glass door, Jonah saw the exact stray cat he had described, one green eye, one blue, twitching its tail at him from the railing. Proof. Living and breathing. He felt a thrill course through him, the realization that his words typed in private had just manifested reality outside his window. Most people would have shouted in shock, but Jonah was too guarded to betray emotion so easily. His alarm came out as a stifled gasp, followed by a long moment of silence as he and the cat stared at one another. Cautiously, he slid open the balcony door and offered the cat a scrap of sandwich from the fridge. The cat accepted, devouring the morsel. Then it sauntered inside as though it owned the place, weaving around Jonah's ankles, leaving behind muddy paw prints on the floor. That was the first moment Jonah grasped he had a new and perilous talent, writing things into existence. Jonah spent the night pacing, nibbling at his fingernails, opening random windows in his previous manuscripts to see if they'd come alive. Granted, those had been typed before this phenomenon started. He reasoned that the effect may be recent, linked somehow to his new laptop or some intangible shift in the environment. Whatever the cause, the power was real, and that made it dangerous. All it would take was one sentence, with dire consequences, to fold the entire city into chaos. Each time Jonah tried to ignore this ability, it was easier to pretend nothing was happening. But each time he wrote, the intangible forces behind his words seemed to grow stronger. It became impossible to separate imagination from reality in his small workspace. Once, when describing a thunderous storm for a horror story, thick black clouds swept in, drenching the city in torrential rain for half an hour, though the forecast had been for a clear night. Another time, Jonah's detective character discovered a hidden tunnel beneath an abandoned steel mill. The next morning, local news reported a startling find. City engineers had stumbled upon a secret labyrinth beneath a defunct factory identical to the one in Jonah's story. The potential frightened him. He considered never writing again. That might have been the safest route. But Jonah's compulsion to create was stronger than his fear. Rather than relinquish his craft, he decided to hone it. If his words had the power to reshape the city, then maybe he could use that power for good. The city was full of problems, streets riddled with potholes, families struggling to pay rent, neglected children who roamed alleyways. Could Jonah fix some of these issues with the stroke of a key? He tested this hypothesis cautiously. In the next chapter of his ongoing novel, he described the city unveiling a program that introduced lush community gardens on every rooftop. A few days later, Jonah glimpsed the results. Across dozens of nearby buildings, improvised gardens sprouted in bright plots of soil, complete with rows of vegetables and wildflowers. It was surreal yet gratifying to watch, as if the city itself had decided to adopt his ideas wholeheartedly. News anchors praised the initiative that seemed to arise organically. Officials claimed it was the result of dedicated local volunteers. No one mentioned Jonah. He was content with that. Anonymity suited him well. Still, the transformations in the city didn't always follow his script to the letter. He soon discovered a strange quirk. Once his story introduced a new element, the city found ways to mold that element to its own design. One day, Jonah wrote a paragraph about a philanthropic tech billionaire who donated cutting-edge laptops to underserved students. Within a week, the story manifested as bus stops advertising free coding workshops for the youth. The philanthropic billionaire never appeared, but the city adapted, filling in the gaps with realistic solutions. Jonah marveled at this subtle interplay. His words were catalysts, and the urban environment responded in its own manner. That recognition emboldened Jonah. He drafted grander scenes, weaving extravagant new structures into the city's skyline, glass spires that housed art studios, industrial sites turned into musical conservatories. In each case, changes materialized, but in toned-down, plausible versions. A few old warehouses became galleries, non-profits found spaces to teach music to underserved neighborhoods, and local architecture trended toward more open, airy designs. Jonah was thrilled, almost delirious with creative power. He felt that at last his writing had meaning. It wasn't just entertainment, it was shaping the future of the metropolis. His isolation ended in small doses too. Each time he typed a new story, the city responded with a nudge in his direction. Occasionally, he'd hear a ring at his door and find a new neighbor offering homemade cookies or just stopping by to see if he needed anything. One afternoon, a local librarian called to invite him to a literary meet and greet. She confessed she'd only heard rumors that a writer lived in the building, but caught wind of his name from a friend. Had Jonah unknowingly written that rumor into being? Regardless, he politely declined. Despite his new, far-reaching influence, he was still terrified of personal contact. The cat, however, remained his constant companion. Jonah named him Rorschach for the odd patterns in his black and white fur. Rorschach seemed to revel in Jonah's creative magic. He'd walk across Jonah's keyboard mid-sentence as if attempting to help shape the stories. Sometimes Jonah swore Rorschach was trying to guide him. The cat's paw would rest on a certain key, and Jonah, yielding to impulse, typed out whatever word came to mind. Secrets, illusions, transformation. With each new passage, Jonah felt the power thrumming in his apartment, an electric hum that pressed against his windows. Yet with power came the tug of temptation. Jonah often wrote about altruistic improvements, but a part of him itched to test the boundaries. What if he wrote something whimsical or impossible? Could the city conjure real magic? One day, in a fit of curiosity, he described a fountain in a public park that glowed with an otherworldly blue. When he ventured out after midnight, disguised by a hoodie and face mask, Jonah located that park. And there it stood, a brand new fountain lit by eerie blue lights. Families strolled by, some snapping pictures, others tossing coins in the water. It no longer seemed strange to them, even though it had not existed the previous week. The city simply accepted the new reality. The next step felt inevitable. Jonah wondered if he could bring back his deceased parents, or if that was too perverse. Or perhaps he could conjure small illusions within his apartment for company, living literary characters for conversation. Another idea that beckoned, sinister yet undeniably enticing, was to transform the city into his own personal utopia. He could eradicate crime with a few lines of text. He could end homelessness or cure diseases through a deftly penned scene. The possibilities spun in his mind until he had to close his laptop, eyes squeezed shut to block out the swirl of fantasies. Unlimited power demanded restraint. Still, the temptation gnawed at him daily. Eventually, Jonah's compulsion overrode caution. On a windy, storm-rumpled night, he began typing a news story. His protagonist was a masked vigilante with an uncanny ability to sense injustice across the city. The vigilante had the power to heal the wounded with a single touch. It was an attempt at a direct solution to many ills. A single being who could help eradicate sickness, solve crimes, and protect the vulnerable. As soon as Jonah finished the chapter, he felt the usual surge of energy coursing through the apartment. But the next day, the news was abuzz with conflicting stories. People reported sightings of a masked figure bounding across rooftops, entering hospitals unnoticed, and leaving wards in states of inexplicable recovery. Some revered him as an angelic presence, while others called him a menace. Jonah realized with growing anxiety that his vigilante was an unstoppable force driven by a narrative objective. Fix everything that needed fixing, regardless of consequences. The city responded by branding him a threat. Law enforcement scrambled to identify or capture him. Hospitals welcomed his healing touch, but the authorities worried about vigilantism spiraling out of control. Jonah found himself mired in guilt and uncertainty. He had intended to help, yet his creation had disrupted the natural order. As the masked figure gained public attention, so did a wave of panic. People demanded answers from the government, from the police, from the healthcare system. Why was a mysterious, unregulated individual operating with advanced healing powers? Why was it suddenly possible for one man to defy disease or walk through locked doors? Riots broke out in certain neighborhoods, spurred by rumors that the vigilante favored some communities over others. All of it, Jonah realized, was the city's method of balancing the improbable with its real-world complexities. Desperate to undo the chaos, Jonah set out to write another scene, one in which the vigilante peacefully retired, his mission completed. But every time he tried to type those words, he found that the lines wouldn't materialize on his screen. The letters jumbled into meaningless strings, or sometimes entire paragraphs vanished as he wrote them, as if the narrative had a will of its own now. In frustration, Jonah slammed his laptop shut. The power was slipping beyond his command. His protagonist and the city stood at the brink of a confrontation, and Jonah felt powerless to quell it. Amid that turmoil, Rorschach disappeared. For days, Jonah called for the cat, leaving his balcony door open, only to catch the chill night air instead of the familiar purr. The cat's absence weighed heavily on him. He upended cushions, pawed through closets, even ventured through the hallways of his building at odd hours, calling out Rorschach's name in a hushed voice. No luck. The city carried on with its madness below, overshadowing the missing cat story. Jonah began to suspect that Rorschach's presence, so integral to his writing, had acted as a stabilizing force. Without Rorschach's guidance, the magic spiraled out of hand. When he saw the vigilante's image appear on a billboard downtown, caught in a hazy photo leaping between rooftops, Jonah trembled. He realized the city's metamorphosis had reached a critical fulcrum, and it might topple into chaos for good. He refused to stand idle. Gathering every ounce of resolve, Jonah reopened his laptop. This time, he would write the most crucial scene of his story, the vigilante's redemption and reintegration into society. But to accomplish that, he needed to find a way around the glitch that jumbled his words whenever he tried to remove the vigilante from the plot. After several failed attempts, Jonah took a different tack. He wrote a scene, not about the vigilante, but about Rorschach. He crafted a heartfelt story where the stray cat possessed a magical collar that gave him the power to bind and release other enchantments. In his narrative, Rorschach found the vigilante sleeping on a church pew and gently placed the collar around the masked man's neck. The collar was designed to quell the vigilante's unstoppable determination, returning him to the mortal realm of limitations and moral checks. After that, the vigilante would decide of his own free will to step away from the chaos, having recognized the city did not need an all-powerful savior, but a community that worked together. Jonah's fingers flew across the keys. This time he felt no pushback from the magic. Perhaps the city had realized it was time for a self-correction. Or maybe Rorschach, wherever he was, permitted Jonah to craft this resolution. Once finished, Jonah released the air from his lungs in a long, trembling breath, as though he had been suffocating. The story was done, the scene set in words. Now all he could do was wait for the city to respond. It didn't take long. Within hours, local TV stations reported an astonishing new development. A wave of calm had settled across the city. The masked figure approached a police station, surrendered quietly, then vanished into a swirl of light that left nothing behind but a small collar on the ground. Nearby, a stray cat was spotted flicking its mismatched eyes at stunned onlookers before darting away into the night. There was no more mention of healing miracles or crusading vigilantes. Instead, people spoke of the ephemeral nature of miracles, how they appear and disappear, stirring both hope and confusion. At around 3 a.m, Jonah heard the soft meowing at his balcony. He slid open the door, blinking back tears when he saw Rorschach staring up at him, the magical collar from his story nowhere to be found. The cat strolled in, hopped onto Jonah's desk, and brushed its tail across the keys of the laptop. Jonah scooped Rorschach into his arms, relief washing over him. He set the cat down gently and returned to his seat, pondering what he had learned from the harrowing ordeal. He realized something important. The city had a pulse of its own, a soul that recognized the difference between constructive inspiration and reckless meddling. Jonah's power might open doorways, but the city filled in the details, adjusting to maintain its equilibrium. That dynamic dance was an ongoing conversation, one that demanded respect. Jonah wondered if all writers, in some small way, shaped their worlds by the stories they told, the narratives they spun into the collective consciousness. Perhaps he had just stumbled onto a more literal manifestation of that universal truth. From that day forward, Jonah wrote with renewed humility. Rather than forcing grand transformations, he focused on subtle shifts, nudging the city toward empathy, community engagement, creative problem-solving. He wrote about small neighborhood initiatives, volunteer groups, or local festivals that celebrated the city's history. He introduced kind-hearted characters who contributed quietly, expecting no reward, and he discovered that each time he finished a passage, those kindnesses rippled out. The city seemed to come alive with a gentle sense of cooperation, a willingness to connect with strangers and rebuild neglected spaces. Jonah also began venturing outside more often. Whenever he grew weary of his solitude, he'd slip on a jacket, collect Rorschach in a carrier, and head for the elevator. The dizzying press of the crowds no longer made his heart pound as violently as before. Instead, he felt a calm curiosity, grateful to be surrounded by vibrant life. He'd watch from a cafe window as children laughed, old friends embraced, and unsuspecting pedestrians paused to admire a new mural or pick fresh tomatoes from a rooftop garden. In small ways, Jonah had helped to plant those seeds of visual and social delight through his stories. Of course, life remained imperfect. Traffic jams still clogged the roads, and petty disputes still flared between neighbors, but Jonah understood that perfection was not the goal. The true aim was a constant evolving dance between storytelling and real-world action. As he walked those streets, anonymous and unremarked upon, He found peace in the knowledge that his reclusiveness no longer shielded him from the world. In fact, his isolation had given him a unique perspective, the power to imagine a kinder city typed into existence with each keystroke. Rorschach became something of a local legend among the children who spotted him perched on odd corners. They imagined he was a guardian spirit or a ghost cat that had lived for centuries in the city's shadows. Jonah sometimes wove playful references to Rorschach into his stories, a cat slipping through alleyways between scenes, a watchful silhouette on a high ledge. In that way, the city and its writer gave each other a lasting gift, a sense of mystery, possibility, and hope. As the days rolled into months, Jonah's apartment remained the same physically, but its aura was transformed. The once cold and echoing space felt warm, softened by the glow of new possibilities. Jonah no longer felt haunted by the empty mailbox or his uncertain future as a writer. He had inadvertently stumbled upon a calling far beyond commercial success, and if his words never earned literary awards or bestseller status, that was they had already changed the city in ways that awards could never measure. Sometimes he paused at the window, gazing out over the skyline, and thought about all the countless other stories unfolding below, untold epics of heartbreak, romance, and triumph happening simultaneously on the streets he could see and the ones hidden behind concrete walls. The knowledge that he had a part in shaping that tapestry brought a quiet sense of pride. He felt less alone, more connected to every soul who walked the avenues or sheltered in apartments much like his own. On one such evening, as twilight draped the city in a wash of pink and orange, Jonah returned to his desk. Rorschach curled around his feet. Opening a fresh document, Jonah placed his fingers on the keyboard. He began typing gently about a community literacy night where people from all walks of life came together to read passages from their favorite books in a crowded plaza. He described laughter echoing under warm lanterns, the hush of an enraptured audience, the joy of words shared freely among strangers. And as he typed, Jonah sensed the familiar shimmer of possibility in each letter. Tomorrow or the day after, he trusted he'd read about an impromptu gathering in some corner of the city that captured the spirit of what he'd described. A faint smile tugged at Jonah's lips. He leaned further into his chair, feeling more certain than ever that his reclusiveness had been a cocoon and writing was the magic that let him emerge. When he concluded his latest scene, an unspoken vow rang clearly in his mind. He would never allow the power of his words to drift toward reckless ambitions again. The city had taught him that creation and destruction were bound by the same pen, but empathy and responsibility could guide that hand to choose light over darkness. Rorschach hopped onto the desk and nudged Jonah's hand, as if to say, "Well done." Jonah chuckled softly, scratching the cat behind the ears. Outside, the neon lights blinked like 1,000 bright eyes, and he heard the gentle hum of life continuing far below. But inside, Jonah felt a peace he had never known. He saved the document and closed his laptop, leaving the residual magic floating quietly, ready to be woven into the urban tapestry at daybreak. He stood at the window for a final moment, letting the comforting knowledge settle into his bones. That with each keystroke, each story, he was shaping a city hungry for wonder, for hope, for new beginnings. The city gazed back with silent gratitude, its towers shimmering. Tucked away in a modest apartment, Jonah no longer felt invisible. In forging a bond with the city through his words, he had found a purpose as potent and transformative as any spell could be.